but I'm going to start getting things underway. You can see my name in my Zoom box, Stephanie Grilly, Board of Governors member, who will be the conversation facilitator today for our discussion with Dr. Ellen Vora on exploring the anatomy of our anxiety. I think a very topic that's very pertinent, not that it never goes away. Dr. Vora is a functional medicine psychiatrist, also acupuncturist and a yoga teacher. And since the publication of her book in March, The Anatomy of Anxiety, she has been in much demand. If you Google her, you will find her doing presentations to various groups. So we are delighted that she has agreed to come back today. And the format of these sessions, of course, are informal and conversational. So we encourage you to turn on your video. We like to get to attendee questions sooner rather than later. If you would put your question or comment in chat, and then I will call on you and ask you to ask your question. And when you say your question, if in fact at that time you definitely would turn on your video. I am going to tee things up with a few questions. Some of you may have even already gotten Ellen's book, so you may be familiar with various aspects of her ideas and approaches. So, feel free to put your questions in chat, and I'm sure we're going to have a very informative and lively session with Ellen today. So, without further ado, Ellen Vora, thanks for coming and visiting with your fellow alumni, your Yale grads today.
Thank you for having me today, Stephanie. It's truly an honor.
So, if in fact you could, because what is exactly a functional medicine approach to psychiatry? And in fact, why do you call your book The Anatomy of Anxiety? If you would just, spend a little time familiarizing us with what essentially may in fact be a new approach in psychiatry or a new paradigm of psychiatry.
Yeah, so functional medicine, which I recognize is not yet a household term, is basically a new approach to health. It's not new. It's new in Western conventional allopathic medicine, but it's basically thinking about health as how do we identify the root cause of a problem and address it at that level, rather than thinking about, well, someone has a problem, let's suppress the symptoms. A really classic example would be heartburn, where if you have heartburn in allopathic medicine, you might take an antacid. Less acid in the stomach, heartburn solved, problem solved. But it's not really true. It's functional medicine would say, well, why are you having heartburn? Why is the stomach acid leaking into the esophagus? And we would think about increased abdominal pressure. Is that due to obesity, pregnancy, something like a bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine? So in functional medicine, we're thinking, what's causing this problem? And let's address it there rather than just putting a Band-Aid on the symptom. And it's absurd that we're not yet taking this approach to psychiatry, but it's time. And with psychiatry, we have been indoctrinated with the idea that our mental health issues are a result of a genetic chemical imbalance. And I'm not here to dispute the validity of the fact that we have a genetic predisposition for mental health issues. I think that that's true, but it's not the whole story. And in many ways, it's the least hopeful angle to focus on. And so in functional medicine, we would say genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And we can't do a whole lot about our genes, but we can do so much about the environmental influences that impact our mental health. And that includes everything from the quality of our sleep and our nutrition, whether or not we're inflamed, and even more psycho-spiritual elements of our lives, like, do we have good community? Are we connected to meaning and purpose in our lives? These are also determinants of our mental health. And there's a lot we can do about that.
So in your book, as an on the way to addressing the things that we can do with or not, you make the distinction between true anxiety and false anxiety. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I realized, Stephanie, I didn't answer the second part of your first question, which is why I call it the anatomy of anxiety. And for me, it's the revelatory idea that it's time for us to start embracing is that our mental health is not just our genes, it's not just our psychology, it's not just what's happening from the neck up. We, as hippy-dippy as it sounds, our mental health is also impacted by our physical body and our psycho-spiritual health. It's kind of a mind-body-spirit model. So the anatomy of anxiety is recognizing, in many ways, mental health is physical health. And to map where these different aspects of our lives, including our physical body, and how that's impacting our mental health. So the central premise of the book is that we have these two types of anxiety, false anxiety and true anxiety. And I want to give full credit to, this is really based on the work of a woman named Julia Ross. She wrote a book called The Mood Cure, and she identified that we have two types of moods. We have a real mood, which is when something happened and we're in a mood as a result. You might have experienced a loss and you're grieving. And then there's false anxiety or false moods. And this is what she calls emotional imposters. And it's these times when seemingly out of nowhere, we're suddenly irritable or anxious or sad or angry. And our mind is always happy to swoop in with a story that tells us, oh, well, I'm anxious because that interpersonal dynamic is feeling uneasy. But in many ways, that's a retrofitted justification. And if we could truly look under the hood of the body, what we would see is that there is some state of physical imbalance that's tripping our body into a stress response. And then that we experience as a mood state. Might be anxiety, could be panic, could be a change in our ability to focus. And so these are our emotional imposters, or our false moods. And it's been my observation in my practice now for 10 years that a lot of the suffering is actually fits under this umbrella of false moods. And it's avoidable anxiety. It doesn't have to be happening. And I provide a false mood inventory where someone can review. Am I sleep deprived? Am I having a blood sugar crash? Am I over caffeinated today? Something off in my digestion? Am I due for a dose of psychiatric medication? These are some examples of things that can trip our body into a stress response and create a false mood that feels exactly like anxiety or panic. And so calling it false anxiety, I do want to clarify, is not to invalidate the very real suffering. And I know personally, for many years, I was in a state of what I would call false depression. This was a life-altering state. This is very real in its impact and how we experience it. But the false speaks to the fact that there's a straightforward physical cause and path out of it.
So what you're saying is that we have some sort of medical condition, or just even maybe too much caffeine, and that our minds need to attach it to something?
Yeah, so a medical condition, or even something that wouldn't be a fully diagnosable condition, just some state of physiologic imbalance in the moment. And it could be fleeting, could be that we're over caffeinated or inflamed or sleep deprived. It could also be something more significant, like a thyroid condition. And it creates this stress response in the body, which tracks up to the brain, and the brain experiences that as anxiety or panic. And so identifying what is causing this state of imbalance is really, that's the keys to the kingdom. You figure out what in my body is causing this imbalance and you identify it at that level. And then you can avoid a lot of unnecessary suffering. And then at the same time, we have our true anxiety, which is entirely different. And that, I think it's really important to point out, is not something I believe we should be pathologizing. It's not something that we can decaf coffee our way out of. It's not even something I think that we should be suppressing. This is our inner compass. It nudges us. It says, slow down, pay attention. Something is not right here in our personal lives, in our communities, in the world at large. And it's really asking us to translate that feeling of uneasiness and let that fuel purposeful action. It wants us to course correct. It wants us to make some change. And it can be something very grand, like we know that we're supposed to be an activist for a particular cause. It can be something really small, like we should probably call our grandma next weekend. It can range, but it's something nudging us from inside saying, feel uneasy about this, but with a call to action baked into that uneasiness.
So I alluded to how, anxiety currently was a very, germane that, so what would you say to the idea that, if in fact in this world right now you weren't anxious, something would be wrong with you? I mean, I don't know, there's that quote that kind of gets to, rephrased again and again, and who originally said it, to be sane in an insane world means, you don't want to be sane in an insane world. That, if in fact you weren't anxious right now, you haven't been paying attention. I mean, what would you say to the whole concept that right now, that anxiety should be the norm?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very curious to open this up to the group as well. And I would love to hear a lot of different perspectives on this question. The way I think about it is that it's very appropriate right now to be anxious. And it would be somewhat suspect to not be, to some extent, uneasy about various aspects of the state of the world. That said, I think that there are different qualities to these different kinds of anxiety. And I think as soon as we can let that anxiety fuel any kind of purposeful action, the feeling transmutes. It doesn't feel so overwhelming. We don't suffer from it in quite the same way. We start to feel imbued with purpose. I also think that some of us feel a pressure to be every kind of activist and to solve every problem in the world. I think we need to be careful about that. And we are living in strange times where we're capable of being aware of all suffering and everything that's wrong in every corner of the world at all times. And we simply didn't evolve to be able to triage that much information. We evolved in communities of 100, 120 people, much like the residential college system, which I think is many ways modeled after this, right? To understand that that's an appropriate amount of people to be aware of the goings on. And so I think it's really hard for us to triage and to understand, here's how worried and concerned and involved I should be about all the suffering in the world. The way I make it work in my own life, for whatever that's worth, I'm very influenced by this one particular activist named Brittany Peckbeck Cunningham. And she says, we need rested warriors. So I'm very intentional about the fact that I stay informed and a part of the conversation, but I protect my peace of mind in the evening. It's a yin-yang approach. I want to be informed and involved. I want to be bothered by what's not right. But I also know that only when I unplug from that and wind down and truly rest and restore in the evening, can I wake up the next morning refreshed, motivated, able to engage with everything that doesn't feel right in the world. But I'd be very curious to hear how other people strike that balance.
Well, Rosette has a very pointed question. Rosette, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Well, first of all, Ellen, thank you so much for speaking with us today about this very relevant and interesting topic. Yeah, I was fascinated by your earlier comment about physiological imbalance being the root cause of a lot of anxiety that we feel. So my question is, how do you know if you have a physiological imbalance, and specifically, what is the root cause of it?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Thank you. I think these days, a lot of us are dealing with a lot of both. We have a lot of false anxiety and we have a lot of true anxiety. And so sometimes the task at hand is discerning which one is at play in any given moment. The best system I figured out with my patients, at least, is we start with false anxiety. That's the low-hanging fruit, and those are the quick wins. And so I'll actually have my patients go through the false mood inventory and think about what states of imbalance potentially pertain to their health. And we chip away at it. We work on, within reason. We don't try to boil the whole ocean at once, but in some reasonable pace, we figure out, where do you want to begin? What feels approachable or accessible? What feels most resonant? Like if something really sounds familiar, like that's me, we might start there. And we start to reclaim more physiologic balance. And then once we've done some of that work, it clears the air. And there's a lot more clarity around how do we get still and tune in with ourselves and listen for the true anxiety. I find that when we're in a cloud of all kinds of states of physiologic imbalance, it's harder to really know what our true anxiety is. And so once we've done some of that work, then you can start to sit, journal, meditate, process, talk in therapy, and identify, here's what is not the least bit physiologic. This doesn't have to do with gluten or gut health or caffeine. This is my truth. This is my inner compass, and I need to attend to that. And I think that gets clearer the more we can strip away the false anxieties. And to answer one, there was a little question baked into that, like, how do you know if you have some physiologic imbalance? I kind of feel like who among us doesn't in modern life is making a broad assault on our physiologic balance. It's hard to truly be balanced right now. You're really getting adequate quantity and quality of sleep, breathing through your nose, sufficient vitamin D levels, sufficient magnesium levels, your gut is healthy. Tell me your secrets. How are you living in the modern environment and staying in that much balance? But if you are, it's a beautiful thing. Every once in a while, I'll have a patient in true physiologic balance, but it's rare.
So actually, you referred a couple of times now to gut, and the microbiome right now is really hot, really in terms of mental health, physical health. A lot of people are capitalizing upon that. You go online, you can find tests that will supposedly tell you what your microbiome is for $99, whatever. Do you have any general advice for dealing with your gut health, or is it necessary to even find out? Do you need to know exactly what particular bacteria you have? I obviously not just buying something over the counter is really going to give you adequate information. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I do err on the side of less testing in my practice. I don't think we like the idea of it, like, oh, this will give me the answers, as if it then has a actionable conclusion, like then you need this particular probiotic. But I think it's actually more complex, but also in certain ways more accessible than that. When it comes to gut health, one thing to really be aware of is that there's a two-way street between gut health and mental health. And we're now appreciating, the public conversation has gotten to the point where we understand that there is top-down communication. We recognize that when we're stressed or anxious, that this impacts our digestion. We know that we might get IBS when we're stressed. We know that we might have nervous diarrhea. That's where we're at with the public conversation. The part that I want us to be increasingly appreciating is that there is also communication from the gut back up to the brain. And so if your gut is in if it's copacetic down there, that's going to send a communication up to your brain. Everything's okay, go have a great day. But what's more often happening is that our gut is out of balance for one reason or another. Maybe we've decimated our gut flora from repeated courses of antibiotics. Maybe we're eating something we don't tolerate and we're inflamed. Maybe we're just living in the US and exposed to our common pesticides that tend to be pretty disruptive to gut health. And so that's sending a really different communication back up to the brain. It's saying things are out of balance down here. Feel uneasy. It's telling our brain, feel uneasy so that you will rest, so that you will make different choices. So a lot of us are going through our lives in a chronic state of low-grade uneasiness, and it's actually just a response to bad gut health. And so it's a really useful place to focus. The gut is involved with mental health along a few other pathways as well. Our gut flora is involved with the manufacturing of certain neurotransmitters. So when we're taking repeated courses of antibiotics, we can be losing certain Bacteroides strains that help us manufacture GABA, which is a neurotransmitter we don't talk enough about, but it's involved with anxiety and panic and even bipolar disorder. We might be losing our capacity for manufacturing serotonin, which we are talking plenty about. So that's where our gut health also impacts our mental health. And there's also a role that the gut plays in systemic inflammation, which itself directly impacts our mental health. So actionable steps to take with the gut. I don't think you need a $99 analysis of your gut bacteria. I think that's a very nascent field and it's not necessarily really accurate data. In general, what we do know is that a more diverse ecosystem of beneficial bacteria and fungi, parasites, viruses, all of it actually belongs there. More diversity generally translates to more balanced and regulated immune function, healthier gut. And so for a lot of my patients, what we do is we start off attempting to remove what might be irritating the gut. It's a little different for all of us. For some people, it's the things we don't like to talk about, but it's the joys of human life, gluten and dairy for some people. For other people, it might be chronic antacid use or antibiotics for acne, or it could be the birth control pill. It could be certain psych meds. It's a little different for all of us. But you want to remove what's irritating the system, and then you want to add in what can help heal the gut. And that can be things like bone broth or collagen. Glutamine is a supplement that can be helpful. Ghee in the diet can be really soothing. And then the 1-2 punch that really helps us colonize our gut with a more diverse ecosystem of beneficial bacteria is to consume fermented foods alongside starchy tubers. So a classic example would be sauerkraut and potatoes, and kimchi and any kind of, any of the starchy tubers, taro, yucca, plantains, white potatoes, sweet potatoes. And that's what actually helps us colonize our gut. And then the last step to gut healing is to create the conditions for the gut to heal. And that, for many of us, I think for a lot of Yale alumni, is the hardest step, but that's genuine rest, which sometimes feels like a non-starter, like we can't even get there. But if we want healing to take place in our body, it really only happens under the conditions of rest and relaxation. And so that's where we actually need to do less and say no and carve out time for restoration. The last piece I will say is that if you don't already have a squatty potty, run, don't walk. That's required, must-see TV. Everybody should have a squatty potty to help approximate the position that we evolved for elimination. We can say more about that if people want.
So rather than, the expensive bottle of, pre or probiotic, you recommend, sauerkraut and potatoes.
I do. Food works better. There are certainly situations where it's more of a therapeutic intervention to use probiotics for a temporary period of time, but generally I err on the side of using food. And there is nuance to probiotics where for certain conditions like an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, it can actually exacerbate the condition. So I don't willy-nilly just broadly recommend probiotics.
So David Rohall has a question going in another direction. Would you like to ask your question, David?
Well, sure, thank you. And actually, her last paragraphs were very much responsive to my question, which is I'm just curious on this, mind, body, spirit holistic approach that you're describing, what you have adopted as truths that you do yourself. And so, I heard you talk about the sauerkraut and potatoes. I heard you talk about resting at night, but I'm curious about the sorts of lessons that you found so much truth in that you've adopted them yourself.
Yeah, David, thanks for that question. Let me wade my way through that and see if I'm actually understanding and push back if I'm not addressing this correctly. I think back to, I mentioned earlier when I was in a state of false depression and I was in therapy. I had a wonderful psychiatrist. I look at him so fondly, hold him in such high esteem. At the very end of the day, he actually didn't really, it wasn't that effective for me. And what it turns out, what I really needed personally, this is just me and my body, is that I needed to get off gluten and I needed to get off the birth control pill. And that, in combination with some psychospiritual changes, was what did the trick for me. I needed community and I needed connection to meaning and purpose. And those are a little bit less easily prescribed, but no less important. I think that we need to be focused on this. We need to recognize the primacy of that in our mental health. And we can't overlook it, even though we can't prescribe it, take these 3 steps to get there. And so, I live this very much. This is everything that I work with my patients and write about. This is exactly how I live in my day-to-day life. I prioritize early bedtime, except when I don't. I sometimes prioritize community over early bedtime, and I do that very intentionally. I do think that staying up till 2 a.m, talking to the people that you love most in the world is sometimes the right set of trade-offs. I eat in a way that's really deeply nourishing. I've really recognized that the brain is this physical machinery that requires raw materials to function well. And I used to just eat whatever was convenient, addictive, processed, cheap, and I had to learn firsthand that when I focus on nutrient density and use every bite to help check the boxes of the nutritional scavenger hunt and really make sure I'm giving my brain what it needs to function optimally, that's when I feel best. I do a lot of other things intentionally, lots of movement, lots of fresh air and sunshine, connection to nature, dancing, laughter. Music is my religion. Religion is my religion. I found that I personally have made a journey from a kind of like, some people have grown up with organized religion and they might be on a journey sort of bucking some of those pressures. I had the opposite journey where I really grew up surrounded by an atheist environment. And I came in my 30s to a connection to spirituality that's given me quite a bit of meaning and comfort through the challenges of life. So I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Oh, yes, it was very good. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, David.
David, you were nodding. What are your ways?
Repeat the question, please.
You were nodding while I was talking. What are your ways? What are your personal practices?
Oh, I go golfing every morning, and I have the walk in the nature. I understand the vitamin D. I've in early retirement, I've stopped eating out. I've started cooking for myself. I've discovered the benefits of the nutrient density and the importance of greens and the absence of processed foods. I'm very intentional with my alcohol, which used to be a source of many evenings' pleasures, and now is not a part of it at all. So it's a journey. It's a journey of learning, and that's why I signed up for this particular discussion. I haven't attended very many, but I thought there would be. And I was right. There's some truths that someone who's worked in this area professionally might offer that would be useful to me and to all of us. And so, yes, I am nodding because what she says resonates with me incredibly well.
So in fact, Rachel, is I'm going to turn it over to Rachel now, David, because she, in fact, in chat has shared her story of her journey and has a question as a result of that. Rachel, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So I had a recent diagnosis in June and have about a year ago, and since have been kind of trying to triangulate between my gastroenterologist, my therapist, my primary care doctor. And prior to all this, I was also seeing an acupuncturist and have kind of resumed that momentarily, but it's been hard to, and then recently I've actually found that like yogic philosophy and meditation, breathing practices, deep relaxation have been really, really effective in helping with a lot of my symptoms. And I'm an educator, so I'm under a lot of stress over the last like 2 years. But I think it's become difficult to kind of triangulate between these practitioners and to find people that, like, my therapist isn't really very, familiar with mindfulness practices and their different effects. And I wonder kind of what suggestions you have and thoughts about kind of the future of this area of medicine that's more integrated, for people that are trying to kind of marry them all without feeling like you're constantly going to a doctor's appointment or in that way. I hope I'm communicating that right, but.
Yeah, Rachel, you absolutely are. I'm not sure I have a great answer, though you've communicated your question really well. It's tough. I think everyone figures this out or doesn't in their own way. I do think it's really helpful to have a quarterback who kind of gets it all, can bridge the allopathic approach with the more holistic strategies, who understands it and is just in your corner with you, helping you navigate. Some people find that in a health coach, some people find it with a naturopath or a functional medicine doc. Within that, you need to find someone who's not so dogmatically opposed to the allopathic approach, that they can hang with any allopathic interventions you might be finding helpful. I find it's much harder to find an allopathic doc who understands all of the holistic strategies. It's easier to find someone in the holistic world who is open about picking and choosing the best of both worlds. And sometimes some of my patients find that over their journeys, like, they really become the most informed, most effective advocate. And so you might actually be that person in the end. It's not optimal, but it's the way it often turns out.
But do you think people are getting kind of more training generally in the different kind of branches, so to speak? Not really.
The allopathic folks, every year I'm saying I think so, but I'm not fully seeing the evidence of that yet. I get so much med students and psychiatry residents reaching out to me and saying they're hungry for this kind of approach. They want to do it. And of course, patients, the demand is absolutely,
Right.
There's a hungriness for this approach. There is something about allopathic training. It's long. There's a lot of inertia to our conventional medical systems. It's really hard to practice in this way in those systems. I had to really opt out and be like a very weird psychiatrist on the fringe to work in this way. So we're not really there yet. You'll still get some dismissive attitudes. But I think if anything, we've just had a democratization with things like Instagram and TikTok, where it's not all good information, but you actually can get a lot of information from those one or two weirdos out there who are saying, hey, think about health differently.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Good luck with your process.
So Dan Rubin actually has two very interesting questions. Dan, do you want to ask your questions? First one first.
Cool. Thank you. So I am a counseling director in an affluent suburban community. A lot of parents are alums of Yale and other Ivy League institutions and whatnot. But what I've been seeing over the course of my career is certainly, and I put in my question in text, literally a majority of students in my school who are exhibiting significant symptoms of that false anxiety. And, I'm wondering, just for parents, caregivers, what specific advice that you would give to help develop greater resiliency in response to some of these stressors. And then, sort of more broadly on an organizational level, just thoughts about, how to address this on scale in a community that might have some resistance to some of the obvious responses.
Dan, thank you for that question. Gosh, let's see. So I think that it's really tough to be the youth these days. And we'll just put out there, the part that's less easily fixed is their very valid, true anxieties. They are viscerally connected to everything that's wrong in this world. And they're feeling it even more in more of a raw and kind of bald way than we are. We're a little bit more hardened, and they are really just feeling it. And so honor that. I think that's part of their mission here. They're going to hopefully change the face of the world. That said, they are living in a cesspool of false anxieties. And I think that there are certain practices that, like a couple examples that come to mind. I think that we're just, as a population, increasingly inflamed. Our agricultural system, we have more and more soil depletion. Our food is more and more nutritionally bankrupt, and gets the food industry gets even more clever each year about how to engineer food to be hyper palatable. So I think that we've created a lot of imbalance just with nutrition alone. Coffee is now acceptable for teenagers, apparently. It's marketed to them. Here's a milkshake with whipped cream. We say, this is basically a banana split, go for it. And so you see lines of kids at Starbucks. And I think that we have some interesting evidence around how they are more susceptible to that. We've created caffeine addiction and withdrawal even in younger populations. And these are strong coffees. So these really young, already pretty energetic brains are just wired on caffeine. It's making them more anxious. We do more medication and medical interventions, which is a longer and more controversial conversation, but I think that's having an impact as well. And then the biggest piece of the puzzle is likely all things phone. And that includes social media. It also includes the attention economy in general, and the fact that the blue spectrum light from these devices is disrupting everyone's circadian rhythm. So these young developing brains, they're not even getting restorative sleep. And so it's just tough to be young right now. At scale, how do we fix this for parents? I think it's really tough to manage social media and video game use in kids. That's a toughie. If you can manage any degree of decreasing that, just creating more opportunities for kids to be outside, to be playing, to be connecting to nature, just change the use of people's time, and then social media is a little bit less compelling. And I think that we can do a lot as parents to make sure that at least at home, kids are getting some amount of nutrient density. The more, as my daughter gets older and she's going to more birthday parties and eating all kinds of crap, I will put a spoonful of chicken liver pate in her mouth once in a while. So I'm thinking, this is Mother Nature's multivitamin. If she's going to be eating a lot of cupcakes, at least she's getting folate and zinc and selenium and the B vitamins from this bite of chicken liver pate. And then I think that we also have the ability to do a lot of modeling as parents. And the more that we can strike that balance where we're not in denial and we are not plastering on a false smile when things are not okay, but we're modeling resilience and we're modeling rolling with our emotions, accountability, apologizing, just all of these different forms of emotional intelligence. I think that creates a really solid foundation for kids to see those skills and aspire and emulate those skills. And Mark Brackett, I think his name is, Yale professor, who wrote a book called Permission to Feel, that alone and the work he's doing is, I think, has the potential to be so impactful.
So Dan, before I get to Steve Bloom's question, do you want to ask your second question real quick?
Sure. So Ellen, you know, a lot of conversation about nutrition, and I just wondered just your thoughts as a trained psychiatrist on cannabis and other plant-based medicines as treatment.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for that question. I'll try to be more concise as we go. So all of these medicines, like any medicine, it can be good medicine, it can be bad medicine. It depends on the indication of the person, their bioindividuality, and how they're coming to it, and what kind of intention. I have patients for whom cannabis has been so therapeutic. Women with severe sort of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, people tapering off of psych meds, somebody with insomnia. I've seen it be really good medicine and absolutely the lesser of the different options. I think that if someone is relying on cannabis for sleep rather than Ambien, I think that that's a win. I also have patients for whom daily cannabis use seems to really be holding them back in their lives. And whether that's impacting motivation, mood, it's tough to say, but it's not always good medicine. I don't think more is better. I think it can be a beautiful medicine. We come to it with intention. It can be so profound. And so we just need we need to realize that sort of like we have this tendency in the West to say, oh, it's good, so more is better. And I think that we just need to realize it's in the armamentarium, and it's something to reach for with intention when indicated, when appropriate. I don't know if your question included the sort of a more expanded category of plant medicines, things like psychedelics. That's certainly not so much. We don't have to go there, but we're happy to field that question if that's on anybody's mind.
So Steve, I'm sure that was your question, right?
It wasn't, but can I want to thank you, Ellen, also for the great discussion. You can see the chat is lighting up. And I believe we have our first question from a student. And Stephanie, I'd like to defer at least until after Neha asks her question, just because I think it's wonderful to hear from a student at Yale.
Definitely. Neha, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for speaking with us. So I'm a current student at Yale, and I just, a lot of what you were talking about in your talk and in your book resonated with me so much. And I was wondering if you had any tips specifically kind of for college students. I feel like it's so much easier to act, especially like in an environment at Yale where it's, like you have like a limited amount of 4 years, and like there's a lot of messaging that there's so many like opportunities that you really should take advantage of. And it's so much easier to act based on kind of this more fear-based, like immediate academic or social pressures instead of like this longer term meaning or purpose-based healthy way. And I feel like if I really journal or think things through, I have a general idea of the types of decisions I want to make. But in the immediate moment, I feel a lot of maybe guilt or fear when making the decisions that are best for me. So I kind of always like postpone acting based on these values, because I always feel like the whole system isn't there yet. And I was just wondering how people in these types of like multi-pressure environments such as college, how can you kind of overcome this like immediate momentary fear right when you're kind of starting this process? And
do you pronounce your name Neha or Neha?
Neha.
Neha? Neha.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'll do my best with this. I'm not sure I have all the answers. I think that if I can just sort of project my own foibles when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I think that looking back, if I could have given myself 2 pieces of advice, one of them is actually very false anxiety, physiologically focused. I was absolutely, in every sense, out of balance in college. And if I could have just put a little bit more attention towards prioritizing sleep, like an earlier bedtime, and a little more nutrient density and a little bit of time of movement in the sunshine, which is easier said than done, especially in New Haven in January, February, but just a little bit of time every day to keeping physiology intact. I think that goes a long way to making everything else, all the other challenges, more palatable. That said, I think that just in case we're similar in this relationship to perfectionism, I find that is that's hot lava, and it can paralyze us. It can burn us out. And if I could just go back and whisper in my own ear as an undergraduate, I would have told myself, all you can do is do your best. That's enough. And I think that I always carry this feeling of you can always do more. You can always say yes to every opportunity. You can work longer on that paper and make it better. Someone else is outperforming you here, someone is smarter here, this comes naturally to them. And always this feeling of keep scrambling, keep hustling, do better, which in many ways didn't actually create a good product for me. It really just paralyzed me and burned me out. And I was less productive and creative because of it, ironically. But I was also so miserable because of it. So I think it's really powerful to recognize your reasonable best is enough, and you can stop there. And when I say do your best, importantly, I don't mean your 150% effort, bend yourself into a pretzel, squeeze out any possibility of failure. That's not what I mean by do your best. It's do your reasonable best. It's what's something that you show up, you can do something that you can feel proud of, but it's something you can do sustainably. You can do it without getting bent out of shape. And to recognize that even when the challenges of being an undergraduate at Yale, your reasonable best, that 85% effort is enough. And you can give yourself breaks and rest and time to just stare at the wall. And that's not unproductive or slothful or lazy or bad. It's necessary. We need to get back to that yin yang balance of sometimes we are action oriented and productive, and sometimes we are fiercely and unapologetically protecting leisure. We need that to stay in balance.
I think you can say that to Yale alumni as well as Yale students. I think it's, something that many of us carry beyond Yale, that, making the world a better place can sometimes be a heavy load.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Neha, thank you for that question.
Steve, you're up.
Thank you very much. And Neha, thank you for, as I said in the chat, for your courage and candor in asking the question. So I didn't realize it till just a few minutes ago, but on the call is somebody that very much influences my sense of mindfulness and the connection between me holistically and my brain, if you will, and that's Dia Draper. So I want to give her a shout out. I think about my days and my weeks or my months completely differently because of her. One of her life causes has been to think about nutrition and routine, among other things. And so I bring up two things, Ellen, in addition to the fact that Dia exists and she's on this call and really made an impact on me. One is, would you agree that sort of time of day, possibly even day of week, week of month, can also be an influencer on sort of when we do things, in a way that's less stressful? I find that, some people are morning people. I'm being oversimplistic, but there are certain times that make sense, not just nutrition, of course, but times of day. And the second thing, which hasn't come up, is I think you mentioned being out in the sun, outdoors and so forth, which is, of course, a wonderful thing. I wonder if also spending time with people from different generations can be a way of feeling better.
Okay, Stephen, this is great food for thought. Let me answer that last one first, and then I'm going to have follow-up questions on your first question. So I think that, yes. What else to say other than I think that being around people of different generations is so important, and it does shift our perspective in every direction, right? To be with someone older, there's a wisdom, there's a perspective there. To be with someone younger, there's I hang out with a 6-year-old a lot. The way she sees the world connects my synapses in all kinds of new ways every day. I think that, and then I think that there's probably something in our hardwiring that we feel on the proverbial savannah of evolution. Humans were never the fastest species. We were never the strongest species. We were the ones who figured out how to cooperate, how to recognize, like, here are the different roles and the strengths that all the different people in the community bring to help us survive. And I think this is why in our DNA, when we feel connected, we feel safe and at ease. And in modern life, which is so conducive for us to be isolated, we are interacting with screens rather than people. We're siphoned off in our cars and our homes, in our working from home lifestyle, where we're not interconnected. And I think it's creating an underlying sense of uneasiness. And so I think being around people of different generations probably speaks to something really subtle in our hardwiring that's home. So your first question, can you just rephrase it a little bit to make sure I understand?
I think it's just that I feel more aware in the last 5 or 6 years since I met Dia, in particular, another Yale alum, obviously. I'm much more aware of when I can be productive. I know that's not the same as stress and anxiety, but it's a close cousin. Mm-hmm. And so I find, my path of least resistance is a certain time of day after I've eaten a certain kind of meal, as opposed to some other time of day. I just wanted to raise that as a vector.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought. I think most important here is know thyself, and then ideally have flexibility and autonomy in how you use your time to be able to have your schedule reflect that. I think that there's a lot to be said for these different rhythms. We're all slightly different chronotypes, but generally, if we're getting to bed around 3 hours after sunset, that seems to be a range where we're sleeping optimally as humans, and there's less drama about tossing and turning and falling asleep, because when we miss that window, a lot of us get overtired, where our body thinks, oh, there must be a good reason we've stayed awake past the point of being perfectly tired. So the zealous employee our body always is, it secretes cortisol, or stress hormone, to help us work the night shift or go on to participate in the Great Migration. But it's actually just a daily rinse and repeat in modern life that we feel tired, we're falling asleep on the couch, we think that couldn't possibly be bedtime, it's egregiously early, we stay up late, and then we get hit with this second wind and we're tired but wired. So I think that recognizing we have some variation in terms of our chronotypes, night owls and morning birds, overall looking for your tired signs around 3 hours after sunset is a good metric. And then there's a lot of really interesting school of thought, Ayurveda and Chinese medicine think a lot about the daily biorhythms. I find that if your life can accommodate this, it's great to know, when are you most easily focused? Can you block those hours to drop into meaningful creative work? Don't be wasting those hours in Zoom meetings and just be sort of passive and mindlessly sitting back, but protect that time to make a creative, sort of to be able to propel yourself forward. And then I think for menstruating bodies, we have to be so much more attuned to our different rhythms. And this was not something that I was taught. I wish when I turned 12, someone said, hey, your follicular phase, you're going to feel a little bit more outgoing. It's the time when it's easier to feel social and have energy and do a presentation. And then in your luteal phase, it's going to be more inwardly focused. It's going to be a time for more rest and reflection, and to not shame ourselves for that, but to embrace it and really support it. So I think that I don't really understand the male physiology quite as well, but for menstruating bodies, for women of reproductive age, I think it's a beautiful thing to be attuned to those rhythms and actually have our life accommodate that, rather than trying to squeeze our bodies into a mold that's on more of a 24-hour cycle where everything's the same every day of the month. Thanks for that question, Steve.
Thank you.
So we have quite a few questions in chat, and we are getting close to the top of the hour. And I know, given the daytime schedule, some of you will have to sign off, but hopefully we can actually spill a little bit over, and hopefully we can get to all of your questions. But I want to get to John Burke, who's been waiting quite a while now. It's sort of a question comment. And John, if you're still here, do you want to ask your question?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I know Steve, I'm glad to see Steve. Steve, I hope whatever you were eating earlier was healthy. If you would tell us, a little bit more about your diet.
The good news is the apple. The bad news is the nachos.
Okay, the nachos. My son is into HelloFresh, which seems to clear out a lot of things going wrong with my gut from time to time. But anyway, my question had to do with, the term false anxieties. I'm the head of an affinity alumni association, so I interact with current whiff and poofs and also 800 alumni whiff and poofs regularly. And there are a lot of challenges there, particularly with an area that Steve is well familiar with, and that is mentoring. So we have old perspectives intermingling with new ones all the time. And to older perspectives, anxieties that are to them false are very real to current singers. And by the way, singing has probably saved my life any number of times over the last 60 years. So it's a very important thing to have a hobby like it, so you can go off and decompress from time to time, better than drinking. But I've discovered that I get a list of pain points typically from every incoming WIF group. And last fall, after a couple of incidents during the year, a new pain point arrived, which was, can the alumni help fund mental health counseling for those who need it? Now that I know about it, we have to do something about it. And I'm working with Yale, hopefully, to do something. But I've found that even the most rash anxieties are very real to those who are feeling them. and they just don't perhaps know how to define them or know the root causes, as you say. But I often find that I don't like the word false anxiety for that reason. I'm wondering if there's a better adjective we can use to describe it. I can certainly point to a lot of the rash solutions that young people come up with as being false narratives or false, solutions to take or to pursue. And I've found that the older alumni are particularly helpful in identifying those quickly. And as long as they're able to articulate them in a trusting situation, I encourage those interactions. But the false anxiety thing, I'm just wondering, Ellen, if you could come up with a better adjective than that we should use.
Yeah, John, I appreciate the question. And I certainly wrestled with that terminology choice. Perhaps a better set of terms would be avoidable anxiety and purposeful anxiety. And, I think it is worth emphasizing false is not to invalidate the experience of the anxiety. That's very real. And as I mentioned earlier, I personally have been in very false moods that are life altering. They're very real. The false really just speaks to here's the underlying cause and here's the path out of it. So avoidable anxiety is perhaps a more palatable way of describing it. And I think that always there's in a way the falseness or the stress response that we're in when we're in a state of false anxiety or avoidable anxiety, it doesn't necessarily pertain to the content of the anxiety. It pertains to how urgent and overwhelming it feels. So if someone's in a state of false anxiety, what they're bringing forth as what's making them anxious is usually pretty salient and valid. And my position as someone's therapist is always to validate that and explore that, be curious about it, witness it. It's not to say, hey, that's nothing to be worried about. But the falseness is how doom and gloom or overwhelming or sort of how insurmountable that problem feels. And what I find is that when we can chip away at the avoidable anxiety, someone can face those challenges in their lives and say, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. They're more resilient in the face of it. And so I just want to also really appreciate that you're taking steps to provide funding for mental health counseling for students and maybe alumni as well. And that's a beautiful thing. I think more opportunity for people to have some venue for processing what they're going through, what they're up against, and to feel witnessed and held and to be pushed to reframe is a beautiful thing for humanity. So thanks for helping support that.
Well, thank you.
So Gina has a question that's going to circle us back to the classroom, the school setting. Gina, do you want to ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. And some of it you've sort of answered, so I've been thinking about it. So I teach community college and I have some early college students. So, my students are probably 16 to who knows where, right? And I've been teaching about 30 years, and it's amazing how much more mental illness, I'm having a bad week, can I have it, that I see now compared to before. And I think we've talked about some of those reasons. But to be purposeful, so I am going to be teaching a course I've never taught before this fall. We call it Dimensions, but it's basically an introduction to college studies. So habits, skills, tools. And I thought, gosh, what if I were to build in some piece about health? And I've been taking notes. So, maybe there are things like, avoid blue lights, but maybe there's an article or maybe your checklist, or what would you, if you had a week, what would you focus on? Because I've got to do a lot of other things.
Gina, I want to say thank you to you and someone else was, I think, Rachel, you're also on the front lines in education, and gratitude to our educators at the front lines in this pandemic. The heroic efforts that you've put in to keep us all afloat is just massive. Thank you. I think that this increase that you've perceived in mental health issues. It's interesting, right? And I think that on some level, it is a little bit of the normalization. We can talk about mental health. It's a little bit of a decrease in stigma. This is all good stuff. It's a little bit the increase in true anxiety, that the world is getting funkier. That's undeniable. But then I think there's a less comfortable conversation to be had about the increases in false anxiety. Some of that is sort of PG rated, and I've already brought that forth. Like we're more inflamed, we're less well nourished, we're all the blue light, all the social media. This is creating states of imbalance. I have a much more like, this is a difficult topic to wade through sensitively. It requires an hour's worth of nuance, but I'll sort of give a very cursory touch on it, which is that I think there's also a role that our psychiatric medications themselves are playing. And that's complex because it's not here to stigmatize medication. I'm not here to say that, I'm a psychiatrist, I prescribe these medications. I find them to be transformative for so many of my patients. And sometimes they can impact the chronicity of how someone's suffering, or just the rhythms of being in intradose withdrawal with things like stimulants, with things like benzodiazepines. It, I think, is even contributing to some of the increase in mental health issues. And we are more and more medicated. So it's something I want us to at least be looking at. It's not to shame or to say, to get black or white about psych meds, but just to make sure we're not overlooking that. To actually answer your question, what could we do quickly? If you had a week, in my book, I put something called the false mood inventory. That could be a place to start. It's basically when we're in these false moods, it's hard to have the presence of mind to say, oh, maybe I'm in a blood sugar crash. Oh, you know what? The world is feeling so overwhelming right now because I know I didn't get sleep last night, or I had an extra double espresso this morning, or I'm hungover. And to sometimes just have that list to reference, almost like cut it out, put it on your refrigerator, can be really grounding, can take the charge out of a state of feeling really overwhelmed, and can point us sometimes to an immediate solution and sometimes just to plant a seed for changing habits in the future. So that would be a place I would start. I think that I like to do a kind of 1 hour lecture about, here's a little bit of what you can do to support your physical body. Here's a little bit what you can do to support psychospiritual health. And I think you can cover a lot of ground in even just an hour. Happy to talk offline if I can throw some more ideas your way. But thanks for that.
So we have about 10 minutes left, if people will keep that in mind. We've been introduced to Dia via Steve, but now Dia Draper has her own question. Dia, would you like to ask your question to Ellen?
Oh, it wasn't too big of a specific question, but the psychedelics did come up, and I would actually be really curious to hear your thoughts on those as it relates to healing.
Yeah, thanks, Dia, and hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
So, psychedelics, yeah, it's a big topic right now. It's on trend. A lot like what we were saying earlier with cannabis. Let's phrase it this way. I think that mental health, the field of mental health, is in crisis. And even before this recent study about, serotonin is not actually the root cause of depression. This came out just last week, and functional psychiatrists like me are kind of saying, well, and there's more to that story always. But I think that we've been in crisis for a while. Our treatments are not as effective as we'd like them to be. Our work is not accessible. There's issues with insurance coverage. There's issues with wait lists. There's just so many problems in our field. And I like the role that psychedelics have as a potential new approach to treatment, partly because the data that we have thus far is that when indicated, when appropriate, all the caveats apply. This is not just medical legal caution, but I think there really are times when psychedelics are contraindicated. I think a chaotic brain does not need more chaos introduced to it. I think that they're much more useful for any kind of entrenched states in the brain. But when indicated and appropriate, it's a really nice new effective approach to addressing mental health issues. And part of the reason they work is sort of an extension of what we already know can be effective. They're active on the 5-HT2A receptors in the brain, so it's a serotonergic effect. They can increase BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which can improve neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Translation into English is that we can grow and change and adapt. They can quiet the default mode network, which has interesting implications for when we feel a little bit less this narrow definition of ourselves as a separate individual and a little bit more interconnected to the collective. That is a really interesting reframe to come out of a psychedelic ceremony with. But to me, what's actually most exciting is that there's something called the mystical experience hypothesis, the psychedelics, where the extent to which you have a peak mystical experience in a psychedelic treatment is correlates with, is proportional to the effect size. So it's going to be a more effective antidepressant and have more of an enduring antidepressant effect if you have more of a peak spiritual experience. That's interesting. That's different than the SSRIs. And it speaks to the fact that we're not just creating a biochemical change, but we are giving somebody a new perspective, and one that might, to me, it plays around with the edges of, is something vastly beyond our comprehension occurring here in physical existence? And I'm not here to proselytize, or I don't have the answers. I don't know, but I think there's something really healthy about spending time in that liminal question and seeking and asking that question. And it seems to be therapeutic when people get to that state. It seems to help people feel a sense of meaning or guidance. They can trust, they can surrender a little bit more easily in their lives, which is a really nice salve for anxiety, which pertains to uncertainty and themes of control. And I just will close with a quote from a colleague of mine named Will Su, who talks about how he says psychedelics are not just tools for healing trauma, but they're agents for making spirituality palatable to our starving Western world. And so I find it to be an exciting new line of treatment. It's not going to be the panacea, nothing ever will be, but it's nice to have one more tool in our armamentarium. Thanks, Dia.
So I don't think we're going to get to all of our questions, but one thing we will do is Kate and Chelsea will save chat so that Ellen will be able to see questions and your names for once we don't get to. You've referenced your general checklist about sort of imbalances and or what direction to go. Is that available in any place else other than other than your book? Is it available on your website?
That's a good question. It probably should be. It's not currently, but I could get around to that at some point. Currently, it's just in the book, although my content on Instagram in somewhat of an inefficient way, covers all of those. It checks all the boxes, but not all in one slide.
Okay, so we've got about 2 minutes left. I want to thank Ellen. This has been fantastic. I wish we could get to more of the questions. You have a really open way of sharing this information that, sort of has I think gives us optimism maybe that somehow or another this getting beyond anxiety and depression is actually something that is achievable. Do you have any sort of, I'm going to give you some opportunity to have final thoughts, takeaway that you want to leave us with?
Stephanie, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who asked a question and everyone who's just been here listening. I mean, this is truly such an honor, and it's exciting to me. I like to spread this new way of thinking about mental health, and I think about the ramifications of each and every one of you and who you impact in your lives, whether it's kids or students or whoever you're coming into contact with. And I think that, Stephanie, you really touched upon the most important takeaway, which is that it's time for us to think a little differently about mental health. And if you take nothing else away, it's that there's always reason for hope. It's not to invalidate how difficult things are, but mental health issues are not a destiny. We have our genetic predispositions, we have our traumas, we have our challenges, This is all true, but we also have an infinite capacity to grow and change. And there's a lot that we can do, and it's not so inaccessible. A lot of it are things that we can do for ourselves. So always reason for hope, most importantly.
Well, thank you. So I would be remiss if I didn't encourage the attendees today. We have 2 shows left in the summer series. The next one will be 2 weeks out with dynamic speaker mentor Rhonda Joy McLean, who will be talking about new skill sets for the future of work, including things like empathy. So in a way, it might be a continuation of this discussion. And then 2 weeks after that, a young alum, Bo Reynolds, double amputee, who will be speaking about normalizing disabilities, which I think will be very informative for all of us who want to do the right thing and be informed and be an ally. So I thank Ellen again, and I thank all of you for coming to our conversation today.